The wildlife photographer had spent what he'd later call a perfect day in Victoria's Alpine National Park. Golden hour shots of a wombat nosing through leaf litter, morning mist rising off mountain ash tree, and at dawn, a wedge-tailed eagle riding thermals with its wings spread impossibly wide. By sunset, he was back at camp, eating heated stew by firelight while watching stars emerge one by one in the vast darkness overhead. At around 9 o'clock he crawled into his tent and fell into the kind of deep, exhausted sleep that comes only after a full day outdoors. The sleep of someone who feels completely safe in the wilderness, who believes they're alone with nothing but the sounds of the bush at night. 2 days later, back home and finally finding time to download his photos, he settled into his desk chair with a cup of coffee and connected his camera to the computer. The import window showed 147 images, a pretty good haul. He began scrolling through them, already mentally selecting which eagle shots to submit to the wildlife magazine that sometimes bought his work. The wombat series told a nice story, and the landscape shots captured the high country's austere beauty perfectly. And then, nestled between the eagle series and a couple of shots he took at sunrise, there was an image that made his breath catch in his throat. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m, hours after he'd gone to sleep. The photograph showed the interior of his tent, illuminated by the harsh white light of the camera flash. The composition was careful, almost artistic in its framing. His boots sat just inside the entrance, exactly where he'd left them. His backpack leaned against the tent wall in the same position he remembered. And there, centered in the frame like a portrait subject, lying in his sleeping bag, was a man, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, with the vulnerability of deep sleep. It was him. His hands started shaking as the reality settled over him like cold water. Someone had unzipped his tent while he slept, moving with such absolute silence that he'd never stirred, never sensed the presence, mere inches away. They'd stepped inside his private space, reached down close enough to touch him, close enough to do anything they wanted, and carefully lifted his camera from its strap beside his head. They'd turned it on, disabled the sound so the shutter wouldn't wake him, composed the shot with an artist's eye for detail, and taken his photograph. Then they'd returned the camera to its exact position and disappeared back into the night, leaving no trace of their presence except this single, impossible image. Unable to process it alone, and really, how could anyone process something like this alone? He did what people do in 2020 when reality stops making sense. He opened Reddit, created a throwaway account, and typed, "Something happened to me in the high country and I can't explain it." The post appeared on a Thursday evening in March, and within hours the comment section filled with responses. Some called it fake, creative writing for internet points, the kind of campfire tale that sounds too perfect to be true. But others knew. They shared their own stories. The hunter who woke to find something had moved all his firewood when he slept. The camper who discovered boot prints circling his tent in the morning with no trail leading in or out. The hiker who'd felt eyes watching from the tree line for hours but never saw anyone. And there it was, about 15 comments down. Someone wrote, "You met the button man. Consider yourself lucky he was in a playful mood." Welcome to Struth, a podcast where we venture into Australia's most perplexing mysteries that continue to defy explanations decades later. I'm your storyteller, and today we're travelling to the Victorian High Country, which stretches across northeastern Victoria in a landscape that seems designed to swallow people whole. The Alpine National Park alone covers over 6,400 square kilometres, Victoria's largest national park, an expanse of mountainous terrain where rescue might be days away and a twisted ankle can transform from inconvenience to life-threatening emergency in the time it takes for the weather to turn. The Wonnangatta Valley sits in particularly isolated country, accessible only by four-wheel drive along tracks that become impassable rivers of mud after rain. And when snow falls between June and August, roads closed completely, sealing the valley from the outside world for months at a time. Towns like Mansfield serve as the last outpost of civilization before you enter true wilderness, the final place to buy supplies, fill your tank, tell someone where you're headed, and hope they remember to raise the alarm if you don't come back. Beyond Mansfield, mobile reception exists only in rare pockets, usually at high points, like weather stations, where signal can reach over the ridgelines. And even then, it's unreliable, cutting out without warning as you move between valleys. This landscape demands respect in ways that city dwellers often fail to appreciate until it's too late. Temperatures can drop without warning as cold air drains into valleys at sunset, turning a pleasant afternoon hike into a hypothermic nightmare if you're not prepared. Dense fog rolls in and reduces visibility to mere metres, transforming familiar terrain into a disorientating maze where every tree looks the same and tracks disappear into white nothingness. The terrain itself hides countless dangers. Loose rocks that shift under your boots, unstable ground that collapses into hidden voids, drop-offs concealed by vegetation that can send you tumbling into ravines. And there's history here, the kind that seeps into the soil and makes you understand why locals tell stories. In December 1917, James Barclay, manager of the isolated Wannangata cattle station, was shot dead under circumstances that were never fully explained. His murder remains officially unsolved more than a century later, the killer's identity lost to time and wilderness. It's a reminder that the high country has always been a place where people can disappear, where violence can occur far from witnesses, where the vast emptiness swallows secrets and keeps them. When people do go missing in the high country, there are always plausible explanations that don't require sinister human intervention. Hypothermia does claim lives when temperatures drop, and wet clothing turns deadly. Falls from cliffs or into ravines can kill instantly or leave someone injured and unable to call for help where mobile signals don't reach. Medical emergencies like heart attacks, strokes, diabetic episodes, well, they become fatal when you're hours away from medical care. Even if someone does hear you, bodies get carried off by wild dogs or concealed by dense vegetation, buried under landslides, washed away by flash floods. This wilderness has 1,000 ways to erase evidence, using nothing but rain and wind and time and the natural processes of decomposition. But when experienced people vanish without trace, people who know the dangers, who carry proper equipment, who've hiked these trails dozens of times, then the comfortable explanations, well, they start to feel a bit inadequate. When the numbers grow and search parties equipped with thermal imaging and cadaver dogs find nothing, not a body, not a boot, not a single dropped item, well, people start looking for patterns in the disappearances. They whisper about places you shouldn't camp, about tracks where the feeling of being watched becomes so oppressive you turn back. And eventually, when enough people go missing in the same area, they start talking about him. Warren Meyer disappeared on Easter Sunday, March 23, 2008, in circumstances that should never have resulted in a permanent disappearance. The 57-year-old civil engineer was experienced in the bush. He knew the area well and set off from Dom Dom Saddle for what should have been a simple 4-hour bushwalk. He did the right things, carried all the right equipment: phone, GPS, maps, whistle, food, water, the kind of preparation that's supposed to keep you safe in the wilderness. He was expected to meet his wife for lunch at a predetermined time and location, a sensible precaution that meant if something went wrong, rescuers would know where to look. He never arrived for that lunch, and Warren never came home. Searchers found his locked car exactly where it should have been, but from there the case took an unexpected turn. They discovered something that changed the entire nature of the investigation. A large marijuana crop hidden in the bush nearby, the kind of operation that generates serious money and attracts serious violence. Reports came in of semi-automatic gunfire echoing through the valley that morning. the distinctive rapid crack of weapons that shouldn't exist in these remote areas. A tip that alleged that Meyer had stumbled across the drug operation and was murdered to protect it. And police confirmed that a man named Williams was in the area that morning, but died before he could be questioned about what he might have seen or done. Meyer's body was never found, despite searches that covered the area repeatedly. The wilderness kept that secret, and whether it's hiding evidence of murder or simply concealing the remains of a man who met with an accident, no one can say for certain. David Prideaux vanished on June 5, 2011, and his case carries the weight of tragedy compounded by conspiracy theories that refuse to die. The 50-year-old wasn't just any missing hiker. He was head of maximum security at Barwon Prison, one of Victoria's toughest facilities, housing some of the state's most dangerous offenders. He was an experienced deer hunter who knew the risks and took proper precautions, carrying his rifle, GPS, radio and supplies when he set out on the Buckland Spur track at 7:45 that morning with his brother-in-law. Then nothing, just silence where there should have been radio check-ins, emptiness where there should have been a man. Heavy winter snow hampered the searches that followed, teams struggling through conditions that made the already difficult terrain nearly impossible to navigate. They covered 10 square kilometres repeatedly, in spring when the snow melted, in autumn when vegetation died back, and again over the years, hoping each time that they'd spot something previous searchers had missed. But they found nothing except the gnawing absence of answers. A coroner eventually presumed him dead with cause unknown, the best official conclusion possible when there's no body, no evidence, no witnesses. The timing just over a year after gangland figure Carl Williams was murdered at Prideaux's prison under suspicious circumstances sparked conspiracy theories about whether Prideaux had been silenced because he knew too much about corruption or criminal connection. But despite extensive investigation by police who understood those theories and took them seriously, no evidence of foul play was ever found. His family believes his body is still up there on that mountain, waiting to be found, while others wonder if the absence of evidence is itself evidence of something more sinister. Conrad Whitlock left perhaps the strangest trail of all. A series of inexplicable decisions that don't add up to accident or suicide or any rational explanation. On July the 30th, 2019, at 3 a.m, a time when most people are deep in their most restful sleep, the 72-year-old rose from bed beside his wife of 52 years and drove 150 kilometres to Mount Buller. He'd been suffering from unexplained headaches that concerned him, but instead of waiting until morning to see a doctor as his wife assumed he would, he drove through the darkness to a ski resort in the middle of winter. Police found his white BMW at a spot locals call Unnamed Corner, the car sitting in perfect working condition just minutes from the ski village. Inside they found his jacket, his phone, his wallet, his keys, everything you'd need if you were planning to drive home. There was no note, no explanation, no reason for the vehicle to have stopped in that particular location or for Conrad to have left it. Inspector David Brown told media that officers found nothing to indicate why the car had stopped. It had the keys, it started without a problem and had fuel in the tank. The mystery wasn't mechanical failure, it was human behaviour that made no sense. His wife made her peace by believing he'd suffered some kind of medical episode related to those headaches. Perhaps a stroke or seizure that left him confused, causing him to wander from the car disoriented and die somewhere nearby from exposure or the effects of the medical crisis. It's a reasonable theory, the kind of explanation that provides closure even without certainty. But they never found him, despite searches that should have located a body if he'd simply wandered off and collapsed. The coroner couldn't determine where, how, or why Conrad Whitlock died, only that he had driven away from home in the early hours and never come back. Niels Becker disappeared in October 2019, and his case particularly troubles investigators because he was the kind of person who shouldn't go missing. The 39-year-old was extremely fit and experienced bushwalker who didn't take unnecessary risks or venture into terrain beyond his capabilities. He'd planned his solo 5-day trek for months, studying maps, checking weather forecasts, telling multiple people his exact route and expected return date. All the precautions that are supposed to prevent exactly what happened. On October 26, he messaged family that he was heading back to his car, estimating the hike would take 6 to 7 hours over familiar terrain. But after that message, there was nothing but silence and the growing dread of people who knew something was very wrong. The search that followed was massive, by any measure. Over 70 searchers, including volunteers and professional rescue teams. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanning from above. Drones covering areas too dangerous for ground teams. Mounted police able to reach remote locations and cadaver dogs trained to detect the scent of human remains even when buried or concealed. They combed 800 square miles of wilderness, covering and recovering terrain until they'd exhausted every reasonable possibility. They found nothing, not his body, not his pack, not a single dropped item that might indicate where he'd gone or what had happened. Police believe hypothermia was the most likely cause of death, his body probably still lying somewhere in that vast area, concealed by vegetation or terrain, waiting to be found by chance, years or decades from now. It's a plausible theory that accounts for the lack of evidence and the statistical reality that people do die of exposure in the high country every year. However, there was one detail that made everyone pause. One piece of information that transformed this from a simple case of a hiker dying in the wilderness into something that fed speculation and theory. The last confirmed sighting of Niels Becker was by the Button Man. Becker had passed through the area near the hermit's camp at the Crossroads, a strategic high point where experienced bushwalkers stopped to get a bit of phone reception and check their position, and the Button Man watches everyone who passes. Russell Hill and Carol Clay disappeared in March 2020. The 74 and 73-year-old were having a secret affair, slipping away together for camping trips that Russell's wife didn't know about. A deception that would later complicate the investigation when detectives had to piece together timelines from people who hadn't known the full truth. Russell too was an experienced bushman who'd camped in the Wanangata Valley many times before, and he was equipped with radio equipment that he used to contact friends around 6 p.m. that evening, checking in as experienced campers do when they're in remote areas. The next day, other campers arrived at their site and found something that immediately signalled this wasn't a case of people getting lost. The site had been destroyed by fire, not just a campfire that had gotten out of control, but a deliberate destruction of evidence. Everything was burned. Tent, equipment, Russell's specially equipped Toyota 4-wheel drive, was singed and abandoned with its contents scattered. His drone was missing, an expensive piece of kit that someone had taken from the scene. Both Russell and Carol had vanished, and the fire seemed designed to obscure exactly what had happened to them. When the case finally broke open, the pattern of disappearances seemed to point in an obvious direction. The territorial bushman who knew every hiding place in the wilderness, the destroyed campsite suggesting someone who wanted to eliminate evidence, the mounting number of people vanishing in the same area. Police connected dots, drew lines between cases, built theories, and every line seemed to lead back to him, to the man who lived in those mountains and watched everyone who passed through his domain. His real name has never been publicly confirmed. It's a small mystery nestled inside a larger one. Police know his identity. They've interviewed him on multiple occasions, checked his background, run all the standard investigations. But they've chosen not to release it to the media or public, perhaps out of concern for a man who's committed no proven crime. Perhaps because naming him would only intensify the obsession and harassment he's already experienced. He's known only by his nickname, earned from the peculiar habit of carving buttons and earplugs from deer antlers, which he wears in stretched piercings that give him an unsettling, primitive appearance. He's somewhere in his 70s now, though witnesses consistently describe him as looking younger. His face weathered by decades of exposure to sun and wind, but his body still capable of feats that would exhaust men half his age. He moves through the forest with a grace that seems impossible for someone in their 70s, navigating terrain that tears at clothes and skin without apparent effort, appearing and disappearing with an ease that multiple witnesses describe as unnerving. There's something about the way he moves, silent, economical, purposeful, that raises the hairs on your neck, that triggers some sort of ancient part of your brain that recognises a predator even when your rational mind insists he's just an old man who likes to hunt. Witnesses who've encountered him describe what they call a 1,000-metre stare, though perhaps distant, unblinking gaze would be more accurate. The look of someone who spent so much time alone that normal social cues have eroded, who looks through you rather than at you, who seems to be evaluating something you can't identify. It's the eyes that bother people most, the way he watches without seeming to blink enough, the way your brain registers that something is slightly off about the interaction, even if you can't articulate exactly what's wrong. He disappears into the wilderness for weeks or months at a time, and during those periods he lives at what locals call the Crossroads, a strategic high point near a weather station that gives him commanding views of the valley approaches for kilometres in every direction. It's one of the few spots in that wilderness with reliable mobile phone reception, making it a natural waypoint for experienced bushwalkers who use it to check their position and call home to report that they're safe. But while hikers think they're stopping at an empty piece of wilderness, they're actually entering someone's living room, walking through what he considers his territory, being observed from vantage points they don't know exist. He hunts with traditional spears he crafts himself. He's become an expert bushman with intimate knowledge of every track and valley, every water source and shelter location, every sight line and hiding place in thousands of square kilometres of terrain. Sometimes he builds stone pyramids on roadsides, mysterious constructions that some interpret as art, others as territorial markers, and still others as part of an elaborate system for tracking who enters and leaves his domain. He has no criminal record. This is a fact that police have confirmed repeatedly when addressing media speculation about whether he could be responsible for the disappearances. The Mansfield Courier, the local paper whose journalists actually know him as a long-time resident rather than the mysterious figure portrayed in Melbourne media, published articles defending him as a local character, eccentric, certainly, but not the dangerous pariah that city reporters were painting him to be. But the encounters themselves tell a different story, one that exists in the uncomfortable space between completely innocent and provably criminal. Crime writer Andrew Rule, who hosts a bloody good podcast by the way, described the pattern that's emerged from dozens of witness accounts. Deer hunters venturing deep into the high country will be sitting around their evening campfire, feeling secure in their isolation, when they'll realise someone is there. Not approaching, already there. The button man will have materialised from the darkness with no warning footsteps, no snapped branches, no sound at all to announce his presence. He even sits down, uninvited, begins making conversation that ranges from awkward small talk to very pointed questions about why they're in this area, his area, what they're hunting, how long they're staying. The conversation itself isn't overtly threatening, but there's an edge to it that makes experienced outdoorsmen deeply uncomfortable, a sense that they're being evaluated according to criteria they don't understand. One hunter awoke at 11 p.m, preparing gear for a night stalk, only to discover the button man had erected an entire camp immediately adjacent to his own while he slept, not just sitting nearby, fully established with swag laid out, pack arranged, firing constructed, as if he'd been there for hours rather than having appeared silently in the darkness. When the startled hunter asked what he wanted, the button man simply said he was checking who was in the area, then sat by the fire, uninvited, saying very little, just staring with that unsettling gaze while the hunter tried to decide whether this was a threat or just extremely odd behaviour. The encounters themselves tell a darker story than the official statements would suggest. Deer hunters who've spent decades in the high country, men who can track an animal by the faintest disturbance of leaves, who instinctively know when they're being followed by the weight of silence, who have developed the situational awareness that keeps you alive in the wilderness, describe the button man as something that shouldn't be possible given his age and the terrain. They'll be casing a valley at dawn, scanning for movement through binoculars, completely alone in terrain they've hunted for 30 years and know as well as their own property. Then they'll lower their binoculars and turn around, and there he is, just stood there, not approaching from a visible direction, not making any noise that would announce his presence, just suddenly there, as if he'd materialised from the morning mist itself. Others describe returning to carefully hidden firewood supplies, only to find them ransacked by someone who knew exactly where to look. These aren't casual stashes visible from main tracks. They're supplies hidden in rock crevices, beneath carefully arranged deadfall, in places you'd never find unless you were watching someone hide, observing from a concealed position while they went about their work. Bushies, experienced outdoorsmen who've been coming to the same spots for years, who know every rock and tree, return to find their firewood gone, and they know with cold certainty someone must have been watching when they cached that supply. Someone saw exactly where they put it, waited for them to leave the area, and came down and took it. The violation isn't just the theft of some firewood, it's the certainty that you were being observed the entire time you thought you were alone in the middle of nowhere, that someone was up there on a ridgeline, watching through trees, cataloguing your movements, deciding what to do about your presence. The question that no one can answer, that hangs over every account and every speculation, is what does he do with all that watching? What decisions does he make based on what he sees? When he evaluates hikers and hunters passing through territory he's claimed, what criteria is he using? And for the people who have disappeared, Meyer, Prideaux, Whitlock, Becker, did he watch them too? Did he observe them making their way through the wilderness and decide something about them that the ones who came home safely don't want to imagine? Is there some quality that marks certain people as acceptable and others as needing to disappear? Charlie Lovick, whose family has lived in the high country for generations and knows the region's history and characters better than any outsider could, noted with frustration how media attention destroyed whatever isolation the button man had carved out for himself. TV companies called requesting help to locate and corral him for interviews, as if he were a dangerous animal rather than a human being. People drive out specifically to find him, photograph him like he's a tourist attraction, post their encounters on social media for likes and shares, and ridiculous podcasters like yours truly sit and tell stories safe in their little offices about his escapade. It's exactly what someone who retreated to wilderness to escape human contact would find intolerable. But here's what all the publicity and speculation couldn't answer, hasn't answered. What remains the central mystery even after thousands of hours of investigation. Could this territorial eccentric who moves like smoke through wilderness, who knows every hiding place and sightline in thousands of square kilometres of terrain, who watches from shadows while others think that they're alone, could he be responsible for making people disappear? Or maybe he just watches them disappear. Police had to find out, because by 2020 the pattern of disappearances had become impossible to ignore, and his name was on everyone's lips as the most likely suspect. In May 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic locked down the rest of Australia, search and rescue police hiked into remote wilderness to reach the button man's camp, making their way to the Crossroads where he'd established his base. The man who prefers solitude and has spent years avoiding unnecessary human contact eventually agreed to talk, although whether this was cooperation or calculation, no one could say for certain. Police weren't there to accuse him. They had no evidence that would justify an arrest, no bodies, no witnesses, nothing concrete enough to bring charges. They sought his help instead, approaching him as someone who might have seen something useful, reasoning, quite rightly, that if someone had observed suspicious activity in this wilderness, it would be the man who watches everyone who passes through. Crime writer Andrew Rule revealed it was a very intriguing chat, a characteristically understated description of what must have been a surreal encounter between investigators trained in reading human behaviour and a hermit who'd spent years perfecting the art of revealing nothing. The button man was cooperative in his way, providing information about hikers and hunters moving through his territory, confirming dates and descriptions that helped police to establish timelines. He did confirm seeing Niels Becker on October 26, 2019, making him the last person to report seeing the experienced bushwalker alive. Police found no evidence linking him to any crime, nothing beyond eccentric behaviour and territorial protectiveness that, as one source noted, isn't actually illegal. Being creepy, watching people without their knowledge, approaching camps uninvited, living in the wilderness without proper permits. None of these things constitute murder, or even prove knowledge of. The absence of evidence frustrated investigators who suspected he knew more than he was saying. But suspicion without proof is useless in court, and the button man seemed to understand exactly where that line was. It was at about this time that the Hill Clay case broke open in a direction no one had anticipated. Detectives working that case obtained footage from automatic number plate recognition cameras at Mount Hotham, the kind of patient, methodical police work that slowly builds cases when there are no witnesses and no obvious leads. Russell Hill's phone data showed the device travelling between Dargo and Mount Hotham on March 21st, the morning after the couple vanished, the phone moving when it should have been stationary with its dead or dying owner. Cross-referencing this movement with camera footage, they found a Nissan Patrol towing a trailer, captured at 9:48 a.m, heading away from the Wanangata Valley. Only one vehicle matching this description had travelled that route in the relevant time frame without being photographed entering from either direction. The vehicle belonged to Gregory Lynn, a 57-year-old former Jetstar pilot, about as far from the profile of a wilderness hermit as you could imagine. A suburban professional with a wife and family, a respectable career, no obvious connection to the high country or to the button man. But sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones that look completely ordinary. So, 2 of the disappearances are solved, bodies recovered, killer convicted and imprisoned. The case that had dominated headlines and fueled speculation for years had an answer, and the answer was relatively mundane. Not a mysterious hermit who watches from the shadows, but an airline pilot who made a catastrophically bad decision and then tried to cover it up. Police formally and very publicly dismissed the button man as a suspect in the Hill Clay case, making clear he'd never been seriously considered, despite all the media attention. But 4 people remain missing: Meyer, Prideaux, Whitlock, Becker. And here's what must keep investigators up at night. The button man was at the Crossroads when Niels Becker passed through, the last person to see him alive. He was in the area, living in camps and watching his territory when the others vanished as well. Warren Meyer probably encountered those marijuana growers on the morning he disappeared. The gunfire and the crop and the police tip all pointing toward violence that had nothing to do with mysterious hermits. His death was likely mundane in its brutality, wrong place, wrong time, stumbling onto something that made him a liability to be eliminated. But his body was never found, despite searches that covered the area where he should have been. And the button man camps in that exact territory knows every gully and cave and concealed spot where remains might be hidden. Did he see something that morning? Did he hear the gunfire and investigate finding Maya's body where the killers left it? Does he know something he's not sharing? Because it might put him in the firing line. David Prideaux most likely died from natural causes in harsh terrain during winter conditions. A heart attack or stroke or hypothermia taking him while he was alone. His body lying somewhere in that vast wilderness waiting for hikers to stumble across it decades from now. That's the most probable explanation, the one his family believes, the one that doesn't require human evil. Probably his remains still are just lying out there beneath the snow and vegetation, preserved by cold and concealed by chance. But he was a prison boss who'd made very powerful enemies, men who knew violence, men who had connections on the outside. What if it wasn't an accident at all? What if someone who knew the high country intimately, someone who could navigate that terrain and make a body disappear forever, was contracted to ensure David Prideaux never made it home from that hunting trip? Conrad Whitlock's 3 a.m. drive to Mount Buller makes no sense under any rational analysis. A medical episode caused by those headaches seems likely. Confusion and disorientation leading him to abandon his vehicle and wander into the wilderness where he died from exposure or the underlying medical crisis. That's what the evidence suggests, what his family believes, what allows them to maintain some peace. Except the button man has been known to approach vehicles at night, has been reported standing in the middle of roads forcing drivers to stop. What if Conrad's 3 a.m. journey wasn't driven by medical crisis, but by something he saw on the road, someone who flagged him down or stood in his headlights until he stopped? What if he left his jacket and phone and keys because he thought he was only stepping out for a moment to help someone or investigate something? Niels Becker probably died of hypothermia somewhere in that 800 square mile search area, his body lying in a gully or ravine that search team somehow missed, waiting to be found by accident years from now, when a hiker stumbles across remains and wonders whose story ended there. But by his own admission, the button man was the last confirmed person to see him alive, watching him pass through the Crossroads on that October day. The Crossroads is a natural waypoint where multiple tracks converge, a logical place for an innocent sighting that means nothing. Probably just coincidence that the last person to see Niels Becker before he vanished forever was the territorial hermit who knows how to make things disappear in the wilderness. Probably, but probably isn't certainty, and the gap between probable and proven is where doubt lives and families suffer. We want simple answers that fit cleanly into categories of guilty or innocent, monster or victim. Either the button man is responsible for all these disappearances or is responsible for none of them. Either he's a dangerous predator who should be locked away, or he's a harmless eccentric we've unfairly scapegoated because his lifestyle makes us uncomfortable. The button man exists. That's not in question. Not speculation or theory, but documented fact. Police have interviewed him. Locals know him. Dozens of people have encountered him over the years. What he's capable of, what he's seen, what he knows that he's not sharing, that is where certainty ends and speculation begins, where the facts give way to theories that can never be proven or disproven, where families of the missing are left wondering whether the man who watches from the mountains knows what happens to their loved ones. The Victorian high country remains what it's always been, beautiful in its way, dangerous in its indifference, and utterly unforgiving of human error. The landscape doesn't care whether you disappear through accident or malice, keeps your secrets either way. Warren Meyer, David Prideaux, Conrad Whitlock and Niels Becker are still missing, their families still caught in the terrible limbo of not knowing, unable to properly grieve, unable to move forward, unable to let go of hope that somehow, impossibly, answers might be still to come. 4 unsolved cases in the same area, all within the button man's territory, all within 12 years, a pattern that might mean nothing or might mean everything. And he's still out there right now, Still camping illegally in wilderness he's claimed as his own. Still hunting with spears he crafts from materials the land provides. Still watching from elevated positions as people pass through territory he considers his domain. Still silent about what he's seen, what he knows, what he's done in decades of living alone in mountains that keep their secrets better than any vault. So, if you find yourself in the high country and someone emerges from darkness to sit uninvited at your fire, if you look up from the flames to find an old man with stretched ear piercings and a penetrating stare watching you without speaking, you've met him. The photographer's picture, if it's real, if it actually happened the way he described, suggests playfulness of a sort. A game of I could have done anything while you slept and you never would have known. But the missing people suggest something else entirely, something that transforms playful menace into real danger. Maybe we created a monster from our fears, transforming a harmless eccentric into a boogeyman because we needed someone to blame for tragedies we couldn't explain. Maybe I'm contributing to that right now. Maybe we're quick to scapegoat outsiders, to fear what's different. Maybe the button man is exactly what police say he is. An odd character, territorial and unsettling certainly, but innocent of any crime beyond camping without permits and making people uncomfortable. Or maybe there's a reason locals whisper his name with unease, even as they defend him from outside criticism. Maybe there's a reason hikers feel watched in certain areas and choose to camp elsewhere, even though they can't articulate why. Maybe there's a reason the button man camps at the Crossroads specifically, not just for the view or the mobile reception, but because it's the perfect place to see who's coming and going, to observe and to evaluate, to decide who's interesting, who's vulnerable, and who might not be missed right away if they never made it home. Thanks for listening to Struth in this episode on the Button Man. Catch us again next week where we'll be chasing some min lights in Australia's outback. I also just want to thank everyone for the support that they've shown so far. All the likes, the subscribes, all the stuff on social media, it's been really encouraging. And I'm glad you're loving these Australian mysteries as much as I love telling them to you. If you've got a thought for an Australian mystery that you'd like me to cover, don't hesitate to reach out. struthpodcast@gmail.com, or just look up Struth on Facebook or Instagram, you'll find it there. Send me a message, tell me what you think. Thanks for listening, we'll catch you next week.